Everyone mocked the quiet janitor's son for being poor, until Parents' Day, when a helicopter landed at school and the most powerful CEO in the city stepped out, calling that same boy, "my son."
The first time Noah Cole realized he was different, it was because of his shoes. They were clean but old, the soles slightly worn, the kind of shoes that looked out of place in the polished hallways of Westbridge Academy, where most of the students arrived in chauffeur-driven SUVs and talked casually about ski trips, horse riding lessons, and summer homes. Noah was only 9, but he was old enough to notice the glances. He noticed how the other boys looked at his plain backpack, how the girls wrinkled their noses at his homemade lunch packed in a blue plastic container, and how their parents gave polite, careful smiles to his father at drop-off, the kind of smiles people used when they didn't think someone belonged. Ethan Cole saw it all too. Every morning he drove Noah to school in an old pickup truck with faded paint, wearing scuffed boots, dark jeans, and a gray work jacket that made him look more like a maintenance man than the billionaire founder of one of the largest tech companies in the country. He kept his head down, kissed Noah on the forehead, and reminded him to be kind. That was always his last instruction: be kind. Noah never understood why his father said it with such seriousness, as if kindness were more important than grades or talent or winning, but Ethan always did. Since the death of Noah's mother 3 years earlier, Ethan had rebuilt his entire life around one promise: that his son would grow up understanding the value of people, not the price of things. He had seen too much of what wealth did when it was handed to children without wisdom. He had watched grown men in boardrooms lie, flatter, betray, and destroy each other over numbers on screens. He had buried the woman he loved, knowing that all his money, all his power, all the private doctors and private planes in the world had not saved her. After that, the mansion felt hollow, the luxury obscene, the image of perfection unbearable. So he sold the story the world expected and built a quieter one for Noah. They moved into a modest house. Ethan dressed simply in public. At school, he never arrived with security, never used his last name for influence, never corrected anyone when they assumed he worked with his hands for a living. He let the world misjudge him because he wanted his son to learn something few rich children ever did: that dignity had nothing to do with appearance. But children could be crueler than adults because they had not yet learned to hide it. By Noah's second month at Westbridge, a group of boys in his class had begun calling him Janitor Jr. It started with small jokes when he answered questions too well in class, or wore the same jacket twice in a week, then turned into louder insults in the cafeteria and on the playground. The worst of them was Mason Blackwell, the son of a venture capitalist whose family donated a new building to the school every few years and acted as though they owned it. Mason had the polished confidence of a boy who had never been denied anything, and he made a sport of embarrassing Noah whenever teachers looked away. "Did your dad fix the toilets before dropping you off?" he asked one morning, loud enough for 3 tables to laugh. Noah kept eating, his ears burning. "Maybe he can clean up after lunch, too," Mason added, grinning at the others. Noah wanted to say something sharp and brave, something that would make them all stop, but his father's voice lived inside him like a rule: be kind. So he stayed quiet, and in the silence the laughter grew. That afternoon in art class, a teacher asked the students to draw their families. Most children sketched beach vacations, fancy houses, and smiling parents in expensive clothes. Noah drew himself and his father standing by the pickup truck under a cloudy sky. His father's hand rested on his shoulder. His mother, as always, existed only as a sunlit memory in the corner of the page, a figure with soft hair and a bright dress, because Noah was afraid that if he stopped drawing her, he might forget her face. When the teacher praised the picture for its feeling, Mason leaned over and smirked. "Looks like a charity poster," he whispered. Noah shoved the paper into his folder so fast it tore. At pickup, Ethan saw the rip, the red edges of Noah's eyes, and the way his son kept staring out the window instead of talking. Ethan's chest tightened, but he said nothing at first. He drove them home through the orange light of evening, one hand on the wheel, the other aching to fix a pain he had chosen to allow. Finally, just before they turned onto their street, Noah asked in a small, careful voice, "Dad, are we poor?" Ethan's grip tightened. There it was, the question he had feared from the beginning, not because Noah needed the truth about money, but because he was beginning to measure himself by what others saw. Ethan looked at Noah, really looked at him, and saw the hurt he had tried so hard to keep away. Then he smiled sadly and said, "No, son, we are not poor, but some people are, even when they have everything." Noah frowned, confused, and turned back toward the window. Ethan faced the road again, his jaw tense, knowing the lesson ahead would cost more than any fortune he had ever made.
That night, Noah's questions stayed with Ethan long after the house had gone quiet. Their small home, tucked on a peaceful street far from the glass towers and gated estates that once defined his life, felt especially still after Noah had gone to bed. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table with only the yellow light above the stove and the untouched cup of coffee cooling in front of him, staring at the wooden grain as if it might offer answers he had not yet found. On the wall across from him hung the one photograph he had allowed himself to keep in plain sight, a picture of his late wife, Claire, laughing into the wind on a beach, one hand resting on the shoulder of a much younger Noah. In that smile lived everything Ethan had lost and everything he was still trying to protect. Before Claire died, their world had been filled with private flights, marble floors, charity galas, cameras, and the endless machinery of success. Ethan had built Coal Dynamics from a struggling startup into a global empire, and the world called him brilliant for it. But Claire had always warned him that wealth could become a wall if they were not careful. "Promise me," she used to say, when Noah was still a toddler climbing into Ethan's lap with sticky hands and toy cars, "that he'll grow up knowing who people are, not what they own." At the time, Ethan had laughed, kissed her forehead, and promised easily, the way people promise when they believe they still have years to get everything right. But then illness entered their lives like a thief, and the money that could buy entire buildings could not buy one more birthday, one more dinner, one more ordinary morning with her. In the months after Claire's death, Ethan had stood in expensive hospital suites, signed papers, barked orders into phones, and watched the most important person in his life slip beyond the reach of every resource he possessed. By the time the funeral was over, he understood something brutal and permanent. Money could shield comfort, but it could not build character, and it could not save a soul. That was when he made his decision. Noah would not grow up surrounded by handlers, praise, and a false world that taught him he was better than other people. He would grow up close to reality, close to effort, close to ordinary life. Ethan would become smaller in the eyes of the world, so his son could become bigger where it mattered. But now, as he sat alone in that dim kitchen, he felt the weight of the choice pressing harder than ever, because while humility was a noble lesson in theory, in practice, it looked like a 9-year-old boy swallowing humiliation in a school cafeteria. Ethan leaned back, closed his eyes, and heard again the careful sadness in Noah's voice. "Are we poor?" It had not sounded greedy, it had sounded wounded. He rose from the table and walked quietly to Noah's room, opening the door just enough to see his son asleep under a worn blue blanket, one arm wrapped around the stuffed fox Claire had given him before she died. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, his throat tight. Noah looked so small and asleep, so defenseless, and Ethan felt a wave of guilt that nearly broke his resolve. He could end all of this tomorrow. One phone call, one public appearance, one driver at the school gates, and no one would dare mock Noah again. The principal would smile wider, the teachers would pay closer attention, the parents would suddenly discover good manners, and the children would scramble to become Noah's friend. But that was exactly what Ethan feared most. Respect purchased by status was not respect at all. Friendship built on power was not friendship. If Noah learned that people only treated him well when they feared his father's name, what kind of man would he become? Still, the answer did not erase the pain. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual and made Noah pancakes shaped badly into circles, while the radio murmured low in the background. Noah came into the kitchen quieter than normal, his school uniform neat but his face guarded, and Ethan forced warmth into his voice as he set the plate in front of him. "Big day today," he said. "Math quiz, right?" Noah shrugged, cutting into the pancake without looking up. Ethan sat across from him, no longer willing to let the distance settle between them. "What happened yesterday," he said gently, "that wasn't about you." Noah's fork paused. It felt like it was. Ethan nodded, accepting the honesty.
Sometimes people see simple things and decide they know a whole story. They see old shoes, a small house, a dad in work boots, and they think that tells them what a person is worth. But they're wrong. Noah finally looked up. Then why don't you tell them? The question landed hard because it was so direct. Ethan could not answer with business philosophy or grand principles. He had to answer as a father. Because I need you to learn something most people never do. A lot of people are kind only when there's something to gain. I want you to know the difference. I want you to become the kind of person who treats everyone well, even when nobody important is watching. Noah frowned, still unconvinced, still young enough to want the pain removed rather than explained. But what if they never stop? Ethan reached across the table and placed his hand over Noah's. Then we keep becoming stronger without becoming cruel. Noah stared at their hands for a moment and said nothing. At school that day, the cruelty did not stop. In fact, it sharpened. A gold-embossed notice had been sent home announcing Westbridge Academy's Parents' Day celebration at the end of the week, an event filled with speeches, public recognition, and family donations displayed for all to see. The children buzzed with excitement, but Mason Blackwell saw an opportunity. During recess, he cornered Noah near the basketball court, flanked by two boys eager to laugh. "You better tell your janitor dad not to show up in dirty boots. Parents' Day is for families who actually matter," Mason said with a sneer. The boys laughed, and one added, "Maybe he can volunteer to clean up after the rich parents leave." Noah's chest burned, but this time the insult felt different, heavier, because it wasn't just about lunchboxes or jackets anymore. It was about being publicly ashamed in front of the whole school. He walked away before they could see the tears gathering in his eyes, but the words followed him like shadows. By the time the final bell rang, Noah dreaded Parents' Day more than anything. And when Ethan saw him at pickup, silent again, with his shoulders drawn tightly inward, he knew the storm he had been trying to outlast was only getting worse.
By the morning of Parents' Day, Noah felt sick before he even opened his eyes. The dread had been building all week, collecting in his chest with every whispered joke, every mocking grin, every reminder that the event was designed for families with money to display and pride to perform. Outside his bedroom window, the sky was bright and cloudless, the kind of cheerful spring morning that made the world seem almost cruel for refusing to match how he felt inside. He dressed slowly in his neatest school uniform, smoothing the front of his shirt as if being careful might somehow make him less visible. In the kitchen, Ethan was already awake, dressed in the same plain work jacket and boots he always wore in public, flipping eggs in a pan while coffee steamed beside him. He looked calm, but Noah noticed the faint tension around his eyes, the way his father seemed to think before every word. "Eat something," Ethan said softly, setting a plate in front of him. "You'll need it." Noah sat down, but his appetite had vanished. For a while, the only sound in the kitchen was silverware touching plates and the hum of the refrigerator. Then, Noah finally looked up and asked, "You're coming today, right?" Ethan met his eyes and gave a small nod. "I'll be there." The answer should have comforted him, but something in Ethan's tone felt careful, measured, as if the promise carried a weight Noah could not understand. On the drive to school, neither of them said much. Noah stared out the truck window as polished cars passed them, carrying parents in tailored suits and elegant dresses toward Westbridge Academy's grand event. The closer they got, the tighter his stomach twisted. When Ethan pulled up to the curb, he rested a hand on Noah's shoulder before he got out. "Whatever happens today," he said, "remember who you are." Noah nodded, but inside he wanted to ask a question he was too tired to say aloud. What if who I am isn't enough? The school grounds had been transformed for the celebration. White tents lined the lawn, gold ribbons hung from the entrance gates, and rows of chairs faced a decorated stage where the principal would later deliver his speech. Luxury cars rolled in one after another, and valets moved briskly while well-dressed parents stepped out holding gift baskets, flower arrangements, and donation envelopes. Teachers smiled brightly, eager and attentive in a way that made it obvious which families mattered most. Noah moved through the crowd like a ghost. Clutching the strap of his backpack, his classmates gathered around their parents, showing off watches, shoes, handbags, and stories about what their families had contributed to the event.
He kept looking toward the entrance, waiting for his father's old pickup truck to reappear, waiting for the familiar comfort of Ethan's steady presence, even if it came wrapped in work boots and a faded jacket. But the morning passed, and Ethan did not come. By late morning, the whispering had started. Some students noticed Noah was still alone and began glancing at him with that same mixture of pity and amusement he had come to know too well. Then Mason Blackwell appeared, dressed in a pressed navy blazer, his hair perfectly combed, confidence radiating from him like heat. His father stood nearby, speaking with a principal, both of them smiling like men who knew the world had been arranged for their convenience. Mason looked Noah up and down and grinned. "Where's your janitor, Dad?" he asked, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Did he get stuck polishing the floors?" A few boys snickered. Noah looked away, hoping silence would smother the moment, but Mason stepped closer. Or maybe he realized this event is for real families, not people who sneak in through the service door. The laughter was sharper this time, because there was an audience, children, parents, even a few teachers who heard and chose not to intervene. Noah's face burned. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the grass beneath his shoes, to undo whatever choice had put him in this place among people who seemed to enjoy his shame. "Leave me alone," he muttered, but his voice lacked force. Mason tilted his head with mock concern. "What, are you waiting for him to bring a mop as your family gift?" More laughter. Noah's throat tightened. He scanned the gate again, searching desperately for the truck, for his father's figure, for anything that would prove he had not been forgotten. But still, there was nothing. The principal soon called students and parents toward the main lawn for the ceremony, and the families began taking their seats. Noah sat alone in the back row of chairs reserved for students, trying to make himself smaller, while all around him mothers adjusted collars and fathers shook hands and exchanged practiced compliments. On stage, a large display board listed the names of major donors, and Noah heard someone behind him whisper that some families had given enough to fund an entire scholarship wing. He knew what that meant in this place. It meant value, visibility, worth. The principal stepped up to the microphone, his voice ringing smoothly over the speakers as he welcomed everyone to Parents' Day and praised the families who made Westbridge Academy a home for excellence, leadership, and distinction. Noah barely listened. His ears were full of the sound of his own pulse. Every few seconds he turned his head toward the entrance, each time feeling hope rise and collapse just as quickly. A terrible thought began to form, one he tried to push away but could not. Maybe Ethan was not coming after all. Maybe something had happened. Or worse, maybe he had come to understand that showing up like this, among the wealthiest families, would only make Noah's humiliation worse. The principal continued speaking, inviting selected parents to the stage for recognition, and one by one they walked up to applause while cameras flashed. Mason's father was among them, greeted warmly for his generous donation and continued support of educational excellence. Mason smirked over his shoulder at Noah as if the moment itself proved everything he had been saying all along. Noah blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall where everyone could see them. He folded his hands tightly in his lap and stared at the ground. Then, just as the applause faded and the principal reached for the microphone again, a strange vibration moved through the air. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss, a distant thudding pulse somewhere beyond the school grounds. But within seconds, the sound grew louder, heavier, unmistakable. Conversations paused, heads turned, the principal stopped mid-sentence. The vibration became a roar overhead, and shadows began to flicker across the field. Noah looked up with the rest of the crowd as panic, confusion, and awe spread in equal measure on the lawn. Above the school, descending out of the brilliant blue sky, was a sleek black helicopter coming straight toward the campus.
The roar of the helicopter swallowed the school grounds, turning the polished Parents' Day ceremony into stunned chaos. Chairs scraped against the grass as parents stood, shielding their eyes from the wind and dust thrown into the air by the spinning blades. Teachers rushed children backward in a panic, unsure whether to protect the event or preserve their dignity, while the principal froze near the microphone with his welcoming smile still half fixed on his face. Noah sat motionless, his heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake his whole body. The black helicopter lowered onto the open field beyond the stage with impossible precision. the kind of arrival that belonged in movies, not in the middle of his ordinary humiliation. For one suspended moment, the world held its breath. Then, the cabin door opened. A security officer stepped out first, scanning the grounds with calm authority, followed by two sharply dressed assistants carrying sleek folders and earpieces. And then, Ethan Cole appeared. But he was not the man Noah had watched each morning in a faded work jacket and worn boots. He stepped down in a charcoal-tailored suit that fit him with quiet power, a white shirt open at the collar, a dark overcoat moving in the wind behind him. Every inch of him radiated command, not flashy or theatrical, but the kind of presence that made people instinctively move aside. Across the lawn, gasps traveled from one end of the crowd to the other as recognition hit. Parents who lived on business news and power lists whispered his name in disbelief. Teachers stared, suddenly aware that they had spent months overlooking the father of one of the most influential men in the country. Mason's father, standing near the stage with his donor plaque still in hand, went visibly pale. He knew exactly who Ethan Cole was. The founder of Cole Dynamics, the billionaire CEO whose decisions could move markets and make or break companies in a single afternoon. Noah's mind struggled to catch up. He looked from the helicopter to the man walking toward him and felt as if the whole world had tilted. Ethan did not glance at the stage or acknowledge the people already trying to straighten themselves and act important. He did not look at the principal rushing forward with a nervous smile, or the parents suddenly eager to greet him. He walked past all of them, straight across the grass, until he reached the back row where Noah sat frozen in his chair. Then, in front of the entire school, Ethan stopped, lowered himself to one knee, and looked directly into his son's stunned face. His expression softened into the familiar warmth Noah knew from pancake mornings and quiet bedtime talks. "I'm sorry I'm late, son," he said gently. "I had something to finish before I could come as myself." Noah's eyes filled instantly. For a second he could not speak. All the confusion, hurt, anger, and longing of the past weeks rose in his chest at once, and the only thing he could manage was a trembling whisper. "Dad." Ethan smiled, though his own eyes shone with emotion. "Yes," he said, "and I should have told you sooner that what we have was never the point. Who you are has always mattered more." He stood and offered Noah his hand. The boy took it, rising slowly as if stepping into an entirely different life. Around them, the silence was absolute. The same classmates who had mocked Noah's lunchbox and old shoes now stared at him as though he were someone they had never known. Mason's smugness had vanished, replaced by a frightened stillness. The principal, finally recovering, hurried to the microphone and began stumbling through a frantic welcome, calling Ethan an honored guest and praising his success in language so eager it made several parents shift uncomfortably. Ethan turned toward the stage at last, but there was no gratitude in his expression. He guided Noah beside him and accepted the microphone with the calm assurance of a man who had spoken to shareholders, world leaders, and hostile boards without blinking. "Thank you," he said, his voice measured, carrying easily across the field. "But I did not come here for recognition." The crowd went even quieter. Ethan's gaze moved over the parents, the teachers, the students, and finally settled for a moment on the adults who had spent the morning showing off donations and status. "For months, my son has attended this school without anyone knowing who I am. That was intentional. I wanted him to grow up understanding humility, effort, and the value of being treated as an ordinary human being. I wanted him to learn that respect given to wealth is often not respect at all." His words landed like stones in still water. No one moved. "What I saw instead," Ethan said, "was something far more revealing. Children mocked another child because they thought he was poor. Adults heard it and looked away. Families who speak proudly of leadership and excellence had no problem measuring a boy's worth by his clothes, his lunch, and the truck his father drove." A few parents lowered their eyes. A teacher near the front clasped her hands together, ashamed.
Mason's father's face hardened, then crumpled into embarrassment as he realized the entire field knew exactly whom Ethan meant. "Let me be clear," Ethan said, his tone sharpening just enough to cut. "Money can build buildings, fund ceremonies, and buy influence, but it cannot purchase decency, it cannot teach empathy, and it means nothing if your children grow up believing that a person without status deserves humiliation." He looked down at Noah then, and the severity in his face softened again. "My son has been judged for what he appeared not to have, yet in these past months he has shown more grace under cruelty than many adults here have shown with every advantage in life." This statement broke whatever restraint remained in Noah's heart. Tears slipped down his cheeks, but this time they were not tears of shame. Ethan placed a steady hand on his shoulder and asked quietly, near enough for the microphone to catch it, "Do you want me to make this right?" Everyone seemed to lean in at once, expecting punishment, expulsion, revenge. Noah looked across the crowd, at the boys who had laughed at him, at the adults who had ignored it, at Mason's father standing rigid beside him. When he spoke, his voice shook, but it carried farther than any shout. "I don't want anyone hurt. I just want them to be kinder." The simplicity of it pierced the crowd more deeply than any threat could have. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, overcome not by anger, but by pride. In that moment, he understood that despite every doubt, every painful compromise, every wound Noah had endured, the lesson had rooted. His son had not become bitter, he had become strong. He drew him into a brief embrace, then faced the school one last time. "There," he said, quietly, "that is what true wealth looks like." No one applauded at first. The truth had hit too close, too hard, leaving the ceremony stripped of its vanity. But slowly, one teacher began to clap, then another, and soon the sound spread across the field, not loud and celebratory, but sincere. Noah stood beside his father, no longer small, no longer invisible. And when they walked away together across the sunlit grass toward the waiting helicopter, they did not look like a billionaire and his heir. They looked like a father and son who had lost much, endured more, and chosen character over pride.
If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more emotional stories here on Drew Daily Stories, where every story reminds us that love, character, and family are worth more than money.